If you're an American conservative, you know that the societal values we hold sacred are under attack. They are hanging in the balance. How can you protect those values? By staying informed. The Closing Argument will deliver news and supporting evidence you need to support and defend those values. Here's Paul Smith.
Good morning. This is Paul Smith, your host of The Closing Argument. In this podcast, we discuss some of the important but controversial moral, political, and legal issues that affect us and our families today. I have to give you a warning. Some of the things we discuss are not politically correct, and this may offend some of you, but we will discuss them anyway. This discussion is needed to preserve our liberties, to establish the truth, and to let the world know that there are many people who challenge some of the views that are gaining acceptance in our schools, our media, and our government. I have with me as my guest today, Jeff Holtzinger. How are you doing, Jeff?
Great. Good morning.
Good. We are both attorneys and have been involved in political elected positions. Jeff is also an engineer, and we are going to continue our discussion of climate change. Our prior session, we kind of introduced a discussion of some of the science, and we're going to continue that and talk a lot about CO₂ today. Now, I am not a scientist, but so why should you believe what I discuss? Jeff's not a scientist either. He's an engineer and a lawyer, but why should you believe us on climate change? Well, first of all, I'm just going to report what other scientists have said, and I have found some very reputable, distinguished scientists, and so I think you can believe my report of them as well as them. And by the way, in terms of climate change science, there is no one field or expertise that covers all the aspects of climate change. There is no scientist who is qualified by himself to cover everything. And so, in fact, whoever is an expert on climate change is going to have to be drawing on other experts. And so that's what I'm doing here. And
I think that's a good point, because I think you'll hear so many people that speak and claim to be an expert on it go well outside their field of expertise and make conclusions. And then people believe it because they're a scientist that may be very well qualified in one area, but not qualified in the area on which they're making conclusions. And people don't necessarily understand that, see that. So I think that's a very, very good point to make.
In fact, I have discussed the contents of my book with some scientists, and what I find is they are very reluctant to give an opinion outside their field. And so, they listen, attentively, but so I think the true scientist is kind of like that.
So I think some of the so-called scientists that are making these conclusions outside their field are probably more politicians than they are scientists.
So basically, we, the people, are stuck. You're going to have to get your opinion from someone. You can get it I would get it from people you trust, first of all. And one person who has spoken on climate issues, who is certainly not an expert, is President Joe Biden. And on the day of his inauguration, January 20th, 2021, he announced that the U.S. was rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. He made an executive order revoking the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline that killed 11,000 jobs right on the spot. He announced an indefinite halt to new oil and gas leasing on federal lands and waters. And what he said this day and on other days, he said he wants to become the climate president. He said that's reported in the Washington Post on January 28th. And he said, "It is no time for small measures." He said, "The planet is speeding towards irreversible damage." And he wants to lead the world in an effort to cut greenhouse gases. And so he made John Kerry his climate hoax, or his climate, his climate guy. And
I think you had it right first time. John Kerry is a climate hoax.
I mean, so today is March 7th. We're in I think the 11th or 12th day of the invasion of the Ukraine. And so within the last week, John Kerry was heard to complain that the fighting in the Ukraine is distracting the world from the climate change crisis. And I had to chuckle, but except it's really sad. Well, the purpose of the book I wrote, The Climate Change Hoax Argument, is to expose this hoax. It is said that it is indisputable, that science indisputably concludes that humans are destroying the planet through the burning of fossil fuels, and that if we don't take drastic measures to curtail them it's now down to 8 years, the planet will be irreversibly destroyed.
Paul, you mentioned the Paris Climate Accord, and as you, of course, know, President Trump took us out of that, and people were raising alarm bells, and that was going to be horrible. But I believe the data supported from, and maybe it's not out for the fourth year of President Trump's presidency, but in the third year, notwithstanding the fact that we weren't in the Paris Climate Accord, the U.S. led the world in reduction in emissions. So we are probably the most environmentally conscious, if maybe the most, or one of the most, if not the most environmentally conscious countries in the world. And even though we weren't in the Paris Climate Accord, we were the leader in the reduction in emissions. I believe it was the third year of President Trump's presidency.
I'm glad you mentioned that. And by the way, I want to plug my book, The Climate Change Hoax Argument. You can get it at my website, cpaulsmith.com. But I include that in there. And the reason for the decrease in our carbon dioxide emissions is that we're using a lot more natural gas, which has much less carbon dioxide emissions.
I think by the application of common sense and doing things, every one of us, I think, wants to preserve the environment, preserve it for preserve this planet for future generations. So notwithstanding all the claims about what the Trump administration wanted to do, I think they were still moving forward on common sense, more sound, proven methods to reduce emissions and other things that help protect the environment.
I'm with you. I think we need to adopt and follow sound policies. And right now, the Green New Deal type approach is filled with extreme, expensive, and actually detrimental policies and it's not based on science.
But how can you argue with an expert like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was a bartender and waitress and has a degree in economics from Boston University? So she clearly is a climate expert. And exactly. That's the problem in this country. People are listening to people like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, and she has zero expertise in climate. Right. Or any type of science related to climate.
So is she leading the House, or is Nancy Pelosi?
I think that's a good question. I think it is Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
To give you one example of the soundness approach, when President Biden shut down the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, it did nothing for the environment, was economically damaging, and actually is worse for the environment because it did not prevent the oil from being transferred from Canada down, to southern part of Maryland, of America. It would be transported by truck and so forth. So the Keystone pipeline would have caused fewer emissions, and plus killing all the jobs. So
similar to the fallacy with the electric cars, they believe that all these electric cars, but they fail to look at the batteries and what happens when the batteries are at the end of their useful life, how they're disposed of, and how you get electricity to charge these batteries. You're getting them from coal-fired or natural-fired, power plants. So when you dramatically increase the need for the electrical grid output, if the electrical grid can even support it, you are increasing emissions by forcing even more power to be produced by these coal-fired and natural gas-fired power plants. Now, obviously, natural gas is probably cleaner, but again, similar example, it's counterproductive.
I personally am in favor and support of appropriate solar energy and wind energy and other types of energy. The geothermal is a very interesting one that we can use, but the problem is not the use of these other alternatives. It's just doing it with soundness. And right now, the energy supplied to the United States, about 80% or more comes from fossil fuels. And the rest comes from these green energy ones and a little bit from nuclear and so forth. But if we were to shut off the fossil fuel produced energy, we would destroy our economy. It's got to be done in a gradual way.
And I think as the technology gets better, the market will kind of dictate when we do make some, for instance, to maybe all electric vehicles or a different way of powering vehicles. But I don't think the technology is quite there yet.
Yeah. So again, it's because of the economic problems and the extreme cost of some of these measures that we need to take a step back and realize that it's crazy to go forward with some of these. And so in Biden's Build Back Better plan, really that was the name, but if you look at the meat of it, it includes too many extreme and expensive climate change projects that are not necessary. So let's get into carbon dioxide for a little bit, because initially the climate change movement was focusing on global warming. And when that died out, it switched over to carbon dioxide. And the feeling initially was that CO₂ emissions in the atmosphere were causing global warming. Scientists have shown that that is not the case. And one of the biggest and most recent findings had to do with the global average temperatures between actually 1998 and 2014. In this period of about 15 years, the global warming was basically flat. There wasn't global warming occurring. But during the same period of time, it is true that the CO₂ emissions were increasing steadily. And so that is the CO₂ increases, are they causing global warming? That data would indicate no. And what I'm telling you is what several scientists have said about this. Another aspect of CO₂ is, well, let me ask you, is CO₂ necessary for life on Earth?
It absolutely is.
The Supreme Court in Massachusetts versus the EPA described the CO₂ as a pollutant. What about that?
Well, it's not. I don't think it should be classified as a pollutant. It is something that is used in different processes. It's plant photosynthesis, I believe. So it's a very necessary part. How much is the right balance, I guess, and how much any increase will actually hurt versus being actually causing greater production, for instance, for plants. And you had mentioned in greenhouses is not a settled question. So that's certainly something that has to be looked at, but they have leaped to conclusion that any increase is bad. And that does not appear necessarily to be the case.
All right, you've said a bunch right there. I mean, calling CO₂ a pollutant is like calling oxygen a pollutant. I mean, they both are necessary. Oxygen for human life, CO₂ for plant life. And in fact, Dr. Spencer calls it the elixir of life. He said this: we are at a bizarre point where carbon dioxide is considered a pollutant rather than a scarce nutrient that is necessary for life on Earth. And so that's one problem. You say we don't know what the right amount of CO₂ is. Scientists have shown that today we have about 400 parts per million of CO₂ in our atmosphere, which is an increase up from about 280 parts per million that existed 100 years or so earlier. So the concern is, oh my goodness, that's a lot. Is it too much? But scientists I read say that in greenhouses they actually pump 1,200 parts per million of CO₂ into the greenhouses because it increases crop yield and fruit and vegetable yield. So now another thing about I mentioned the IPCC last time we talked about that, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have, in their projections, they have assumed that CO₂ that gets into the atmosphere remains there for thousands of years. However, several scientists have shown no, that's not the case. It doesn't stay there that long. In fact, it may not even stay there more than a decade. And it's interesting that some of the scientists think they're able to go back in geological record into what CO₂ levels were in previous times. And if the CO₂ levels get below, I think it's 150 parts per million plants and